For centuries, the pyramids of Egypt have been studied, measured, debated, and admired. They are among the most analyzed structures ever built by human hands. Entire fields of archaeology and engineering have been shaped by attempts to understand how they were constructed, why they were designed the way they were, and what they were ultimately meant to represent. And yet, despite all of this attention, the pyramids still manage to produce questions that do not have clear answers. In recent years, a new generation of scanning technologies has allowed researchers to examine these structures in ways that were never possible before. Instead of drilling, excavating, or physically entering sealed areas, scientists can now use non-invasive methods to look through massive layers of stone. These scans are designed to detect changes in density, internal voids, and hidden spaces deep within the monument. Under normal circumstances, the results are predictable. The scans confirm what is already known. They reveal chambers that have been mapped for decades, corridors that appear in historical records, solid stone where solid stone is expected. That is why one particular discovery stood out. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was visually spectacular, but because it appeared in a place where nothing should exist at all. The detail itself is not immediately obvious to the untrained eye. It does not resemble a hidden treasure chamber or a secret room filled with artifacts. In fact, if it had appeared almost anywhere else within the pyramid, it might have been dismissed without much discussion. But its location changes everything. According to the internal logic of the pyramid's design, this area was never meant to contain an empty space. It sits deep within the structure, far from known passages, and disconnected from any functional corridor system. More importantly, it exists in a zone that ancient builders typically treated with extreme caution. To understand why that matters, it helps to understand how deliberate the pyramid's internal design really is. The Great Pyramid, in particular, is not a random pile of stone. Its internal chambers follow a clear hierarchy. Load-bearing zones are reinforced. Passageways are aligned with remarkable precision. Even minor deviations in angle or placement appear to follow intentional patterns rather than construction errors. Everything about the structure suggests planning, foresight, and an advanced understanding of stress distribution, which makes this detail difficult to explain. The scans indicate a void-like feature, an anomaly that interrupts the otherwise consistent internal density of the stone. It is not large enough to be a grand chamber, but it is not small enough to be ignored as a flaw. Its shape is irregular, and its orientation does not match the surrounding geometry. Most importantly, it appears exactly where structural integrity would matter the most. This is not a location ancient builders would normally hollow out by accident. Doing so would introduce unnecessary risk. A mistake in this zone could compromise the stability of the entire monument. And yet, the pyramid has stood for thousands of years, enduring earthquakes, erosion, and the passage of time. That contradiction is at the heart of the mystery. If the feature is accidental, then the builders took a risk that seems entirely out of character with the rest of the design. If it is intentional, then it suggests a purpose that is not immediately obvious and not clearly documented anywhere else. What makes the situation more intriguing is the restraint shown in official interpretations. Researchers describe the anomaly carefully, using precise and cautious language. Reports acknowledge its existence, note its unusual placement, and then stop short of offering definitive conclusions. There is no bold claim, no confident explanation that resolves the issue cleanly. Instead, the feature is described as unusual, unexpected, or requiring further study. Those phrases appear repeatedly. In scientific writing, that kind of language often signals uncertainty rather than dismissal. It suggests that the data is reliable but the interpretation is not settled. And this is where the story begins to move beyond simple architecture. Because when a structure as thoroughly studied as the Great Pyramid presents a feature that does not align with existing models, it forces a reconsideration of assumptions, not dramatic ones, not revolutionary claims, but subtle questions about planning, intent, and constraints. Questions like why this space exists at all, or why it was placed here instead of anywhere else, or why the surrounding stone appears to accommodate it so precisely. At this stage, it is important to be clear about what is not being claimed. There is no evidence that this feature represents lost technology or unknown civilizations. There is no proof that it was designed for a purpose we would consider extraordinary by modern standards. And there is no indication that it contains anything tangible. What exists is a discrepancy. A small but persistent inconsistency between what the scans reveal and what established models predict. And inconsistencies like that are often more important than dramatic discoveries. They are the places where understanding breaks down, the points where explanations become strained, the edges of what is currently known. As scanning methods improve and data becomes more precise, these kinds of details become harder to ignore. They do not disappear with better resolution. Instead, they become clearer, more defined, and more difficult to dismiss. This particular detail does exactly that. The more closely it is examined, the more it resists simple explanation, and the more it draws attention to the internal logic of the structure itself. Because the pyramids, above all else, are systems. Every stone, every angle, every internal feature plays a role within a larger design. When something appears that does not clearly fit within that system, it raises questions that extend beyond a single anomaly. Questions about planning, about priorities, and about what ancient builders understood well enough to intentionally include something that modern analysis still struggles to explain. In the sections that follow, we will look more closely at how the internal structure of the pyramid is normally organized, why this particular zone is so critical, and what happens when the anomaly is examined in direct comparison with known design patterns. Because once that comparison is made, it becomes clear that this detail is not just unusual, it is strategically placed, and that changes the nature of the mystery entirely. The structure that was supposed to make sense to understand why this detail matters. It is necessary to understand how carefully organized the internal structure of the pyramid really is. From the outside, the Great Pyramid appears simple. A massive geometric form rising from the desert, composed of millions of stone blocks stacked with astonishing precision. But inside, the structure is anything but simple. The internal layout follows a clear logic. Chambers are positioned with intention. Passageways are aligned along specific axes. Load-bearing areas are reinforced with carefully placed stone, while empty spaces are kept to a minimum. Every internal feature appears to serve a structural, symbolic, or functional role. This is not accidental design. Ancient builders did not have the luxury of trial and error at this scale. A mistake deep inside the pyramid could not be easily corrected. Once a section was sealed, it became permanent. That reality forced extreme caution, especially in zones under heavy structural stress. And that is what makes this particular anomaly so difficult to reconcile. The pyramid's internal structure can be divided into distinct zones. Near the base, the structure is dense and heavily reinforced. Above that, internal spaces are carefully distributed to manage weight and balance. The higher chambers, while still massive, are positioned in ways that reduce direct pressure on the lower stone. This distribution is deliberate. It reflects a sophisticated understanding of how stone behaves under load. The builders knew where they could create space, and where they absolutely could not. That knowledge is evident in the way the known chambers are arranged. The king's chamber, for example, is protected by a series of relieving chambers above it. These spaces were designed specifically to redirect weight away from the chamber ceiling, preventing collapse. This alone demonstrates an advanced grasp of structural engineering. But the anomaly revealed by the scans does not fit within this framework. It appears in a region that should, according to all known design principles, remain solid. There is no obvious reason to introduce a void there. No functional chamber nearby. No corridor connecting it to other spaces. No structural benefit that is immediately apparent. In fact, creating an empty space in this location would seem counterproductive. This is why some initial explanations focused on the possibility of natural irregularities. Stone settling. Minor gaps caused by uneven block placement, or limitations in the scanning technology itself. But these explanations become less convincing when the surrounding structure is examined more closely. The blocks around the anomaly are not randomly placed. Their alignment suggests planning. The stone courses adjust subtly as they approach the area, as if compensating for something within. These adjustments are too consistent to be the result of random construction flaws. They indicate awareness, and awareness implies intent. What complicates matters further is that similar adjustments do not appear elsewhere without clear purpose. Where chambers exist, the surrounding stone shows deliberate reinforcement. Where passages run, the structure adapts accordingly. But in this case, the adaptation exists without a clearly defined feature to justify it. This raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the internal models used to explain the pyramid's design may be incomplete. For decades, researchers have relied on a relatively stable framework to interpret the structure. That framework assumes a limited set of internal features, all serving known or reasonably inferred functions. Anything outside that set is often treated as an anomaly to be explained away, but the scans challenge that approach. They suggest that the internal logic of the pyramid may include considerations that are not fully accounted for in modern interpretations. Not mystical considerations, not unknown technologies, but practical decisions made under constraints we may not fully appreciate. Constraints related to construction sequences, to temporary spaces, to planning stages that left subtle traces behind, or to functions that were never meant to be permanent or accessible. Another factor that adds to the mystery is the absence of corresponding historical records. Ancient texts that describe the pyramid focus on its grandeur, its symbolism, and its external form. They do not offer blueprints, they do not describe internal layouts in detail, and they certainly do not mention features like this one. That silence creates a gap between physical evidence and historical narrative. In most cases, archaeology attempts to bridge that gap through comparison. Similar structures, similar techniques, similar cultural practices. But the Great Pyramid is unique. There is no perfect parallel to reference. No identical structure built at the same scale with the same internal complexity, which means each unexplained feature carries more weight. The anomaly cannot be dismissed as a trivial irregularity. It exists within a structure that is otherwise remarkably consistent. Its placement disrupts expectations that have held up under centuries of scrutiny. And the more it is analyzed in relation to the pyramid's overall design, the more it stands out as something that was considered rather than overlooked. This does not mean it was created for a mysterious or extraordinary purpose. It does mean that its existence was likely acknowledged by the builders, that they made accommodations for it, and that those accommodations were executed with the same care seen elsewhere in the structure. That realization shifts the question. Instead of asking whether the feature is real, the focus becomes understanding why it was included at all. Why introduce complexity where simplicity would have been safer? Why create a space that offers no obvious structural advantage? And why place it in one of the most critical zones of the entire monument? As we move forward, these questions become more specific. They require a closer look at how this anomaly compares to other internal features, how it behaves under different interpretations, and what happens when its position is analyzed in relation to the pyramid as a whole. Because once that comparison is made, it becomes increasingly difficult to treat this detail as incidental. It begins to look less like an error, and more like a decision. Where the pattern breaks at first glance, the anomaly revealed by the scans does not appear dramatic. It is not a vast hidden hall or a clearly defined chamber with straight walls and sharp angles. There are no obvious corridors leading to it, no visible entrances, and no clear indication that it was ever meant to be accessed. That subtlety is part of the problem. Most internal features of the pyramid follow recognizable geometric rules. Passageways are linear, chambers are symmetrical. Even areas designed to relieve pressure maintain a clear architectural logic. They look intentional, and their purpose can usually be inferred, even if it is debated. This feature does not behave that way. Its shape is irregular, almost hesitant, as if it does not fully commit to being a space in the conventional sense. It does not align cleanly with the primary axes of the pyramid. It does not mirror any known chamber. And it does not follow the proportions typically seen elsewhere in the structure. In isolation, those qualities might not seem significant. Ancient construction was not always perfectly uniform. Minor variations exist throughout the pyramid. But this anomaly is different because of where it appears. It occupies a region that modern structural models identify as critical. This is an area where forces converge, where weight from above is transferred downward through carefully arranged stone courses. Every block in this zone plays a role in maintaining stability. That makes the presence of any void here unusual. In most ancient stone structures, voids are introduced deliberately and sparingly. They serve clear purposes, such as reducing weight above a chamber or providing access between sections. Random empty spaces are avoided, especially in high-stress areas, because they introduce unpredictability. Yet this anomaly exists precisely where predictability would have mattered most. One of the first questions raised by researchers was whether the feature could be an illusion created by the scanning process. Muon scans, for example, rely on detecting particles that pass through stone. Variations in density can sometimes be misinterpreted, especially when dealing with irregular materials. That possibility was taken seriously. But as additional scans were conducted, the feature remained consistent. Its outline appeared again and again, maintaining the same approximate size and location. Independent analysis using different methods produced similar results. The anomaly did not disappear with improved data. Instead, it became more clearly defined. That consistency shifted the discussion away from technical error and toward interpretation. If the feature is real, then the question becomes how it fits within the broader construction process. One hypothesis suggests that it could be a remnant of an earlier building phase, perhaps a temporary space created during construction that was later sealed and forgotten. This idea has some appeal. Large monuments are often built in stages. Temporary corridors or gaps may be introduced to facilitate movement, alignment, or material transport. Once construction is complete, these spaces can be filled or sealed. But this explanation runs into difficulties when examined closely. Temporary spaces are usually connected to the exterior or to known passages. They leave traces that align with construction logistics. This anomaly, however, appears isolated. There is no clear path leading to it, and no evidence that it was ever used as a route or workspace. Another proposal suggests that the space may have been intentionally created as part of the internal stress management system. Perhaps it served to redirect forces in a way that is not yet fully understood. But this too raises questions. Known relieving chambers have clear architectural features. They are positioned directly above critical spaces and follow consistent patterns. This anomaly does not resemble those chambers. Its shape and placement do not match known stress relief designs. In fact, placing a void here without obvious reinforcement would seem to weaken the structure rather than protect it. And yet, the pyramid stands. That contradiction has become one of the most troubling aspects of the discovery. If the feature compromises structural integrity, then the builders either misunderstood the risks or accepted them deliberately. Neither possibility aligns comfortably with what is known about the pyramid's construction. Ancient builders demonstrated extraordinary caution elsewhere. They over-engineered critical areas. They used massive stone blocks to distribute weight. They incorporated redundant features to prevent collapse. Why abandon that approach here? One detail that has received increasing attention is the relationship between the anomaly and the surrounding stone courses. Rather than showing signs of stress or cracking, the blocks around the feature appear stable. Their placement suggests accommodation rather than resistance. This implies that the anomaly was accounted for during construction, not introduced accidentally afterward. If that is the case, then the feature was not a mistake. It was anticipated. This realization forces a shift in perspective. Instead of viewing the anomaly as a problem to be explained away, it becomes a clue. A hint that the internal logic of the pyramid includes considerations that have not been fully recognized. Perhaps the builders prioritized something other than pure structural efficiency. Perhaps symbolic or ritual factors influenced certain decisions. Or perhaps the anomaly served a temporary purpose that left a permanent trace. None of these possibilities can be confirmed with certainty. But each one underscores the same point. The feature does not fit comfortably within existing models. And when a model fails to account for observable data, the model must be questioned. What makes this situation particularly compelling is that the anomaly does not exist in isolation. Similar, though not identical, features have been hinted at in other ancient structures. In some cases, unexplained voids or irregular spaces appear in locations that also seem counterintuitive from a purely structural standpoint. These parallels are rare and often dismissed as coincidental. But their existence suggests that ancient builders may have operated with design principles that do not translate neatly into modern categories. The pyramid, in this context, may represent an extreme example of a broader pattern rather than an exception. As analysis continues, the anomaly remains resistant to simple classification. It is not large enough to be a chamber, not small enough to be ignored, not well positioned to serve an obvious function, and not random enough to be dismissed as error. It occupies an uncomfortable middle ground. And it is precisely that ambiguity that makes it important. Because the most enduring mysteries are not those that defy explanation entirely. They are the ones that sit just beyond the edge of what seems reasonable, forcing repeated reevaluation. In the next section, attention will turn to the explanations that have been proposed in greater detail, and to the small but significant detail that most discussions overlook. The detail that may not resolve the mystery, but that changes how the anomaly is understood. And once that detail is considered, the feature becomes even harder to dismiss as incidental. As soon as the anomaly became widely known, explanations followed. This is almost always the case when new data challenges established understanding. Researchers, engineers, and commentators alike attempted to place the feature within familiar categories, to make it fit existing frameworks rather than force those frameworks to change. The most common explanation was also the simplest. That the feature was the result of natural irregularities in the stone. Limestone is not perfectly uniform. Variations in density can occur naturally, and when millions of blocks are stacked together, small gaps can sometimes form unintentionally. According to this view, the scans were simply revealing a harmless imperfection. At first, this seemed reasonable. But the more closely the anomaly was examined, the harder it became to accept this explanation on its own. Natural gaps tend to be chaotic. They lack consistent shape, they do not repeat across scans, and they are rarely positioned with any apparent relationship to the surrounding structure. This feature does not behave that way. Its outline remains relatively consistent across different scans. Its location is stable, and its relationship to nearby stone courses appears deliberate rather than accidental. These qualities do not rule out natural causes entirely, but they make them less convincing. Another explanation proposed that the anomaly was a byproduct of the scanning technology itself. Muon tomography, while powerful, is still subject to interpretation. Density variations can sometimes be exaggerated or misread, especially when dealing with complex internal geometries. This possibility was taken seriously by researchers, but as independent teams analyzed the data, the feature persisted. Different scanning angles, different methodologies, and different analytical models all pointed to the same conclusion. There was a real density difference in that location. In other words, the anomaly was not an artifact of the measurement process. A third explanation suggested that the space could be a remnant of the construction process. Large-scale projects often involve temporary features that are later sealed. Ramps, cavities, or access points might be created to move materials or align sections during construction, only to be abandoned once their purpose is fulfilled. This idea aligns with what is known about ancient building techniques. However, it also raises difficult questions. Temporary construction features usually leave traces that connect them to the broader building process. They tend to align with known pathways or structural phases. This anomaly appears isolated. There is no evidence of a route leading to it, no sign that it was ever accessible, and no clear indication of how it would have been used during construction. Its position also complicates this explanation. Introducing a temporary void in a high-stress zone would require compensatory measures. Builders would need to reinforce the surrounding structure to prevent collapse. If that reinforcement existed, it should be visible in the stone layout. Which brings the discussion to a critical observation. The blocks surrounding the anomaly show subtle but consistent adjustments. These are not cracks or signs of stress. They are small changes in alignment, as if the structure was designed to accommodate something rather than react to it. This is the detail that most discussions mention only briefly, if at all. The anomaly is not simply a space within the pyramid. It is a space that the surrounding structure seems to acknowledge. That distinction matters. If the void were accidental, the surrounding stone would likely show signs of strain, distortion, or later reinforcement. Instead, what is observed is integration. The stone courses appear to adapt smoothly, maintaining stability while accounting for the presence of the feature. This suggests planning. Not necessarily long-term planning with a clearly defined end purpose, but at least awareness during construction. The builders knew this space existed, and they adjusted accordingly. At this point, the explanations begin to lose clarity. The feature is too consistent to be a scanning error, too integrated to be a random gap, too isolated to be a typical construction remnant, and too well accommodated to be an oversight. This does not mean it served a dramatic or secret function. It does mean that its role has not been adequately explained. One reason for this may be that modern interpretations tend to focus on finished structures. Archaeology often emphasizes what remains visible and permanent. Temporary decisions, intermediate stages, and construction logic that does not leave obvious surface evidence can be overlooked. The anomaly may represent one of those overlooked decisions. A moment during construction when a choice was made that made sense within the context of the time, but that no longer fits neatly into modern categories. What makes this especially challenging is that the pyramid offers no direct commentary on its own construction. There are no inscriptions describing internal planning decisions. No records explaining why certain spaces were left as they were. All interpretation must be inferred from physical evidence alone. And physical evidence in this case resists simplification. The anomaly does not point clearly in any one direction. Instead, it highlights the limits of current understanding. It exposes a small gap between what is observed and what is explained. That gap is easy to dismiss. But it is also where meaningful insight often begins. When explanations feel strained, when language becomes cautious, and when conclusions are delayed, it usually means that something does not fully align. Not enough to overturn existing models, but enough to suggest they are incomplete. The overlooked detail here is not the space itself, but the way the structure responds to it. The surrounding stone does not treat the anomaly as a problem. It treats it as a given. That response implies acceptance, and acceptance implies intent. As attention turns toward the broader implications of this detail, the focus shifts again, away from what the anomaly is, and toward what it reveals about the mindset of the builders, their priorities, their methods, and the decisions they made that are still visible thousands of years later in the silent geometry of stone. In the final section, these implications will be explored more directly. Not to offer a definitive answer, but to consider what this unresolved detail suggests about the limits of modern interpretation and why some questions remain open not because they are unanswerable, but because they challenge assumptions that are rarely questioned. What the detail really challenges. By this point, the detail itself almost becomes secondary, not because it is unimportant, but because of what it represents. A small inconsistency inside a structure that was never supposed to contain inconsistencies. A feature that refuses to be categorized cleanly, even after decades of study and increasingly precise data. The stone has not changed. The scans have improved. But the uncertainty remains. And that persistence forces a different kind of question. Not about what the anomaly is, but about how we decide what makes sense. Modern interpretations of ancient structures are built on models. These models are informed by engineering principles, material science, historical comparisons, and practical assumptions about how and why something would be built. In most cases, they work remarkably well. They explain the majority of what we see. But models are not neutral. They are shaped by modern priorities, modern constraints, and modern definitions of efficiency and purpose. They assume that builders always optimized for the same outcomes we would today. Stability, simplicity, accessibility, clear function. The anomaly inside the pyramid quietly challenges that assumption. It exists in a place where modern logic says it should not. It is integrated in a way that suggests intention. And yet, it does not announce its purpose. That combination is unsettling. Because it suggests that the builders may have been solving a problem we no longer recognize as a problem at all. Or working within a framework that does not translate neatly into contemporary categories. This does not require invoking lost knowledge or extraordinary technology. It requires acknowledging that intent does not always survive interpretation. Ancient builders did not leave us explanations for every decision they made. They left outcomes. Stone arranged in precise ways, following rules that made sense to them under conditions we can only partially reconstruct. When something within that arrangement resists explanation, it may not be because the builders were careless or mistaken. It may be because the question we are asking is slightly misaligned. The anomaly highlights that possibility. It sits at the intersection of certainty and doubt, surrounded by stone that reflects careful planning, yet occupying a space that defies straightforward justification. It is neither chaotic nor clearly functional, neither random nor fully explained. In that sense, it becomes a mirror. It reflects the limits of what we can infer from physical evidence alone. Archaeology is often described as a science of fragments, pieces of information assembled into narratives that attempt to reconstruct the past. Most of the time, those narratives are robust. They withstand scrutiny. They evolve gradually as new data emerges. But occasionally, a fragment refuses to fit. When that happens, there are two options: force it into the existing narrative, or allow it to remain unresolved. The anomaly inside the pyramid has largely been treated with caution rather than force. It is acknowledged, documented, and set aside. Not ignored, but not fully integrated either. It exists in a kind of interpretive limbo. That limbo is uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that more data always leads to clearer answers. Sometimes more data simply reveals the edges of understanding more sharply. The builders of the pyramid worked with stone, gravity, and geometry. They solved problems that were immediate and practical within their context. Whatever purpose this anomaly served, it was clear enough at the time to justify its inclusion and careful accommodation. The fact that it no longer appears clear does not diminish that original clarity. It only highlights the distance between their world and ours. This distance is easy to underestimate. Thousands of years separate modern analysis from ancient decision-making. Cultural priorities shift. Symbolic meanings fade. Construction practices evolve. What once seemed obvious can become opaque, even when the physical evidence remains intact. The pyramid endures, but its internal logic is only partially accessible. And that may be the most important lesson this detail offers. Not that there is something hidden waiting to be discovered, but that some aspects of the past resist translation. The anomaly does not demand a dramatic explanation. It demands patience. It invites restraint. It encourages a willingness to accept that not every feature will resolve neatly within contemporary frameworks. In a way, that restraint is already present in the language used to describe it, the careful phrasing, the absence of definitive claims, the repeated call for further study. Those are not signs of failure, they are signs of intellectual honesty. The pyramid does not owe us clarity. It does not adjust itself to fit our expectations. It remains what it has always been. A structure built with intention, precision, and priorities that are not fully our own. The detail revealed by the scans remains exactly where it is. It has not moved. It has not changed. And it continues to exist without explanation. Not because it defies reason, but because it sits just beyond the boundaries of what reason can currently reconstruct. Perhaps future research will offer new insights. Perhaps a different perspective will reframe the problem entirely. Or perhaps the anomaly will remain unresolved, a quiet reminder that understanding the past is not the same as mastering it. Either way, the presence of this detail does something important. It slows the rush to conclusion. It introduces humility into interpretation, and it reminds us that even in the most studied structures on Earth, there are still decisions embedded in stone that do not announce themselves, that do not seek to be understood, and that persist simply as they are. The pyramid stands. The anomaly remains. And between the two lies a space not of mystery in the sensational sense, but of limitation. A boundary where explanation gives way to acknowledgement. Not everything that was built was meant to be fully explained by those who came after. Some details were simply placed and left.